Most people will walk past a piece of hand-blown glass their whole life and never once stop to look twice at it. It just sits there. It catches a little light, and then it's forgotten. What almost nobody realizes is that some of the most overlooked objects in the world, a chipped vase, a dusty bowl, a box nobody's opened in 20 years, can be worth more than most people make in 5 years of working full-time. I know that now. 3 months ago, I was 21 years old, sleeping in the back seat of my car in a grocery store parking lot, and I spent the very last $500 I had left in the entire world on a boarded-up glass shop that nobody else even bothered to bid on. I wasn't looking for treasure. I genuinely thought I was buying 4 walls and a leaky roof, just so I'd have somewhere, anywhere that wasn't the inside of a 2009 Honda Civic. I had no idea there was a locked room in the back of that building. I had no idea what was sealed inside it. By the end of this video, I'm going to tell you exactly what I found behind that door, what it turned out to be worth, and how one desperate last resort decision completely changed the rest of my life. But you have to understand exactly how far I'd fallen before any of this happened, because that's the only way the rest of it makes sense. So stay with me to the end, because I promise you, this gets stranger and better the deeper I go. My name's Mara Holloway, and 3 months before any of this happened, I was sleeping in the back seat of my car, a 2009 Honda Civic with 211,000 miles on it, parked in the same corner of the same 24-hour grocery store lot, night after night, because the security guard there had stopped asking questions about me a long time ago. I was 21. I had a duffel bag of clothes, a phone with a cracked screen and a charger that only worked if you held it at a weird angle, and a folding blanket that smelled like the inside of a car no matter how many times I washed it. I kept my good clothes, the 2 outfits I used for job interviews and my shifts at the diner, on hangers, hooked over the grab handle above the back door, so they wouldn't wrinkle. I didn't grow up rich, but I didn't grow up like this either. My mum worked retail, my dad wasn't around, and money was always tight, but there was always a roof over my head. That changed fast, the way it does for a lot of people. Not one big dramatic collapse, but a bunch of smaller ones stacked on top of each other until I couldn't dig out. A car accident that wasn't my fault, but still left me with bills the other guy's insurance dragged its feet paying. A landlord who sold the building out from under every single tenant with 30 days' notice. A second job that fell through when the restaurant cut hours across the board. By the time I actually did the math, I was $400 short on rent. And then I was short on rent entirely, and then I wasn't signing anything, because there was nothing left to sign for. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that a lot, honestly, in those first few weeks, lying in the back seat at 2 a.m, listening to the hum of the parking lot lights, telling myself this was a chapter, not the whole story. I still went to work. I still showed up early, hair done, apron tied, smiling at customers who had no idea the girl pouring their coffee had washed her face in a gas station bathroom sink that morning. There was a routine to it by then, the kind that forms around survival whether you want it to or not. I showered at a gym I kept a cheap membership at, just for that reason, timing my visits for early morning before the staff really paid attention to who came and went. I ate 1 real meal a day, usually whatever I could get half off at the diner at the end of my shift, and filled in the rest with whatever was cheapest at the gas station down the street. I got good, in a way I'm not exactly proud of, at looking like someone who had somewhere to be. Pressed clothes, neat hair, a steady voice. Because the second people clock that you don't have anywhere to be, the way they treat you changes completely. What kept me moving more than anything was a number: $500. I'd started keeping it in a Ziploc bag tucked into the lining of my duffel, separate from the rest of my cash, money I would not touch no matter how hungry I got or how badly I wanted a motel room with a working shower for just one night. It wasn't enough for a deposit on an apartment, not even close in this market, but it was the only thing I had that felt like a foundation instead of a hole. I didn't know yet what that $500 was about to become. I just knew I wasn't going to spend it on anything that didn't change something. It was a Tuesday night, and I was doing what I did most nights after my shift, sitting in the driver's seat with the engine off to save gas, scrolling through local auction and foreclosure listings on my phone. Not because I had any real plan. It had just become a habit. A way of looking at a future that wasn't just the inside of my car. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I'd looked at studio apartments I couldn't afford, storage units getting auctioned off for unpaid fees, half-collapsed sheds somebody was trying to sell as handyman specials. Mostly it was a distraction, a way of pretending I had options. Then a listing came up that I almost scrolled straight past. Commercial property, foreclosure sale, former retail workshop space, as-is condition. Building has been vacant approximately 3 years. Starting bid, $500. There was exactly one photo, taken from across the street, slightly blurry. A narrow storefront with plywood nailed over the front window and a faded sign overhead, missing enough letters that all I could really make out was something like LASSWOR, S, $500. The exact amount sitting in the Ziploc bag in my duffel. I almost laughed out loud in the empty car. It felt less like a coincidence and more like a dare. I clicked into the listing and read everything twice. The building had belonged to a man named Walter Doyle, who'd run a glass-blowing shop out of it for over 30 years before he passed away. After his death, the property sat in limbo, distant family who didn't want it, unpaid back taxes piling up, the county eventually moving to seize and auction it off just to clear the debt. Nobody local seemed to want it either. The listing had been up for 2 weeks, with 0 bids. I didn't know the first thing about commercial real estate. I didn't know zoning. I didn't know what as-is actually meant in practice, and I definitely didn't know anything about glass blowing. What I knew was this. It was a building. It had 4 walls and, according to the listing, a working roof as of the last inspection, and it cost exactly the amount of money I'd spent 3 months refusing to touch for anything else. I told myself I could always sell it. Worst case, I'd own a piece of dirt with a building on it instead of nothing at all. Best case, I didn't even let myself finish that thought, because best case felt like something that happened to other people. The auction was 11 days out. I spent every single one of them going back to that blurry photo, zooming in on the part of the sign I could still read, trying to imagine what was behind that plywood. The auction itself was almost anticlimactic. It was held at the county courthouse annex, in a beige conference room with folding chairs and a long table at the front, where an auctioneer in a county polo shirt ran through 11 different foreclosed properties in under 40 minutes. Most of the room was the same handful of investors, guys in their 50s and 60s who clearly did this for a living, flipping through printed packets, barely looking up when each property came onto the block. When the glass shop came up, the auctioneer read off the basics in a flat, practiced voice: address, lot size, structure has been vacant, sold as is, no warranties expressed or implied. Nobody reacted. A couple of the investors glanced at the listing photo and visibly moved on to the next page, like they'd already decided it wasn't worth their time. A retail space that small, on a street that wasn't exactly thriving, with 3 years of deferred maintenance baked in, it wasn't the kind of property that made anyone's pulse go up. $500 opening bid, the auctioneer said. Do I have 500? I raised my hand before I'd fully decided to do it. There was a pause. He looked around the room for a counterbid. Nobody moved. One investor actually shook his head slightly, like he was confirming to himself he wasn't interested, not even at this price. 500, going once, going twice. The gavel came down. Sold. It took less than 90 seconds from the moment the property was announced to the moment it was mine. I had to sign paperwork afterward in a back office that took longer than the auction itself, handing over a stack of bills and crumpled fives and ones I'd spent the last hour before the auction counting and recounting in the courthouse parking lot, like the number might have changed since the last time I checked. When I walked out with a manila envelope holding a deed, a set of keys that hadn't been used in 3 years, and a receipt, I stood in the parking lot for a long moment. Not entirely sure what I'd just done. I owned a building, me 21 years old, and that morning I'd woken up in the back seat of a car with 211,000 miles on it, and now I legally owned a piece of commercial real estate. It didn't feel like victory exactly. It felt like I'd traded one kind of uncertain for another. But at least this uncertain had a roof. I drove straight there from the courthouse, parked out front, and sat in the car for almost 5 minutes before I made myself get out. Up close, the building looked smaller and more tired than the photo had suggested. The plywood over the front window was warped from years of weather. The paint on the doorframe was peeling in long curls. And the section of the old sign I could read from the listing, LASSWORS, turned out, once I got close enough to see the missing letters' outlines, to read Doyle Glassworks, the gold paint on most of the letters worn down to bare wood. The key stuck in the lock at first. I had to wiggle it, jiggle the handle, lean my shoulder into the door before it finally gave way with a groan that echoed back at me from somewhere deep inside. The smell hit me first, dust, old wood, and underneath it something faintly mineral, almost metallic, that I'd later learn was the smell of a cold furnace that hadn't been fired in years. Sunlight came in through gaps around the plywood in thin, dust-filled stripes, just enough to make out shapes, without really illuminating anything. The front room had clearly been the retail side of the shop. There were wooden shelves built into the walls, empty now, except for a layer of dust thick enough to leave fingerprints, and a glass display case in the center of the room with a cracked top panel. A few price tags, brittle and yellowed, were still curled up at the bottom of the case, the handwriting too faded to read. Behind the front room, through a doorway with no door, was the workshop itself, and this was the part that actually stopped me in my tracks. Even abandoned, even coated in 3 years of undisturbed dust, it was clear this had been someone's whole world. A massive furnace sat against the back wall, brick built, with thick iron doors hanging slightly open, like someone had walked away mid-task and never come back. Long steel rods, what I'd later learn were called blowpipes and punties, leaned in a rack against one wall, dozens of them, some short, some nearly as tall as me. A workbench ran along another wall, covered in tools I didn't recognize, wooden paddles, metal tongs, blocks of scorched wood with handles, jacks that looked almost like oversized tweezers, and on every surface, the shelves, the windowsills, a long table near the furnace, there was glass. Not the finished, careful pieces you'd imagine a shop like this would have sold. These were rough, lopsided bowls, vases with bubbles trapped crookedly in the walls, a handful of pieces that had clearly cracked during cooling and gotten set aside instead of thrown away. Practice pieces. Failures. The kind of thing a craftsman keeps around not because they're worth anything, but because he remembers exactly what went wrong with each one. I stood in the middle of that room for a long time, turning in a slow circle, taking it in. I didn't know anything about glass blowing. I couldn't have told you the difference between a punty and a paddle if my life depended on it, but I understood, standing there, that this wasn't just an empty building I'd bought for $500. It was the inside of someone's entire life's work, frozen in place the moment they stopped showing up. I had no idea, standing there that first day, just how much more of that life's work was still waiting for me, sealed away in a room I hadn't even found yet. The next several weeks were the hardest physical work I'd ever done in my life, and I did almost all of it alone. I couldn't afford a dumpster rental, so I filled trash bags by hand and hauled them to the curb a few at a time, timing it with the city's pickup schedule so I wouldn't get fined for putting out too much at once. I couldn't afford new tools, so I cleaned with whatever I could find cheap: a mop bucket from a discount store, sponges, a broom with bristles already half worn down before I even bought it. I still hadn't quit either of my jobs. I'd work a shift at the diner, drive straight to the shop, work until it was too dark to see without electricity I didn't have yet, and then climb into the back seat of my car, now parked in the shop's small back alley instead of the grocery store lot, and do it all again the next day. It was during this stretch, exhausted, filthy, scraping 3 years of grime off a workbench with a putty knife, that I started finding pieces of Walter Doyle's life scattered through the building, almost like the place was introducing itself to me one detail at a time. I found a calendar on the wall behind the workbench, still turned to the month he must have stopped coming in, with handwritten notes in the margins: order more cullet. Call Reyes Ray, kiln shelf. Coming Thurs, show him the punty work. I didn't know who Reyes or R were yet, but the handwriting, small, neat, slightly slanted, felt like the first real glimpse of the man who'd built this place. I found a row of photographs tacked to a corkboard near the front counter, faded almost to sepia from years of sun through the front window before the plywood went up. Most of them showed an older man, Walter, I assumed, at craft fairs and gallery openings, holding pieces of finished glass up to the camera, grinning the slightly awkward grin of someone who isn't used to being photographed, but is proud enough of what he's holding to put up with it anyway. In 2 or 3 of the photos, there was a younger man standing next to him, tall, lean, maybe in his late teens or early 20s in the earliest pictures, with the kind of intense, slightly guarded expression of someone who takes himself very seriously. In one, he was holding a piece of glasswork that was unmistakably more refined than anything else I'd seen sitting around the shop. A tall, twisting vase in deep cobalt blue, with what looked like delicate threads of gold worked into the glass in a spiral pattern, almost like it had been caught mid-motion and frozen there. On the back of that photograph, in the same neat slanted handwriting from the calendar, someone had written, S. First solo piece, The Ember Run. Kept this one. A few days later, going through a battered metal filing cabinet near the front counter, I found something else. A thin spiral notebook, its cover soft and curled from age, filled with the same handwriting. It wasn't a diary exactly, more a working log, notes on furnace temperatures, batches of colored glass, the occasional short, almost offhand line about whoever he was teaching at the time. One entry, dated sometime in the spring, just said, S, is better than I was at his age. Better than I'll ever be, probably. Strange thing to be proud and a little sad about at the same time. I read that line 3 times before I closed the notebook and put it back, not fully understanding yet why it made my chest tighten the way it did. I didn't think much of any of it at the time, honestly. I was tired. I was covered in dust. And I had 100 more urgent things to deal with than a faded photograph and a stranger's old notebook. I pinned the photo back up where I found it and kept working. I had no idea that the initial, that single letter S, and the phrase "the Ember Run" were about to become the 2 most important words in my entire life. I found the door almost by accident about 3 weeks into the cleanup, when I was finally far enough into clearing the workshop that I could see the back wall properly for the first time. It was narrow, narrower than a standard door, tucked into a corner behind a tall metal shelving unit that had been pushed in front of it, whether on purpose or just from years of clutter piling up, I couldn't tell. It took me almost 20 minutes to clear enough space to drag the shelving unit out of the way, and when I finally did, I found a plain wooden door with a deadbolt lock that had no matching key on the ring I'd been given at the auction. I tried every key anyway. None of them fit. For a few days, I genuinely considered just leaving it. I had bigger problems. The building still had no working electricity. The roof had a slow leak in one corner I needed to deal with before the next rain, and I was, by any reasonable measure, still essentially homeless. Just homeless with a deed now instead of without one. A locked closet in the back of an old workshop wasn't exactly an emergency. But I kept thinking about it, kept circling back to it in my head during slow shifts at the diner, during the quiet hour before I fell asleep in the back seat. A door that locked, inside a shop where literally nothing else had been locked. The front door had opened fine with my key. The display case had been unlocked. Every cabinet, every drawer, every tool chest in that workshop had been wide open or easily opened. Whatever was behind that door, Walter Doyle had wanted it kept separate from everything else. I finally called a locksmith, the cheapest one I could find listed, an older guy who ran a 1-person operation out of a van, and paid him $40 I genuinely could not afford to spare, just to get the deadbolt out. It took him about 10 minutes. When the lock finally gave, with a heavy mechanical clunk, I realized I'd been holding my breath. The room behind the door was small, barely bigger than a walk-in closet, no windows, the air inside stale and cool, in a way that felt different from the rest of the building. There was no light fixture, so I used the flashlight on my phone, sweeping it across the space. Crates, wooden crates, the kind built specifically for shipping fragile items, stacked carefully against the back wall, not haphazardly shoved in, but arranged, almost the way you'd stack boxes you intended to come back for. There were 6 of them in total, each roughly the size of a milk crate, sealed with both nails and a layer of foam packing visible at the seams. Stenciled on the side of each crate, in black paint, were 2 words, Ember Run. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, my flashlight beam shaking slightly, not from fear exactly, but from something closer to nervous anticipation, that specific feeling you get right before you learn something that's about to matter. I thought about the photograph. S, first solo piece, the Ember Run. Kept this one. This was it. Whatever the Ember Run was, this was where the rest of it had ended up. I didn't open the crates that night. I told myself it was because I didn't have the right tools to do it carefully without breaking whatever was inside. Which was true. But honestly, part of it was that I wanted to sit with the moment a little longer. For 3 months I'd owned almost nothing in the world except a duffel bag and a Ziploc bag of cash. Now I was standing in a small, dark, windowless room, looking at 6 crates somebody had cared enough to seal up, label, and lock away from everything else, and some part of me, the part that had spent 3 months sleeping in a car, telling myself things would change, needed one more night of not knowing, one more night of pure possibility, before whatever was actually inside replaced it with a fact. I went back to sleep in my car that night with the back room door propped open, the crates just visible in the dark when I glanced over before closing my eyes. The next morning, I borrowed a crowbar and a pair of work gloves from the diner's maintenance closet, telling my manager I had a furniture project I needed them for, and drove straight to the shop before my shift even started. The first crate took longer to open than I expected. The nails had rusted slightly over the years, and the wood had warped just enough to make them stubborn. When I finally got the lid free and pulled back the layer of foam packing underneath, I found a piece of glass nestled inside, wrapped in what looked like an old bedsheet, cut down and used as padding. I unwrapped it slowly, sitting cross-legged on the dusty workshop floor, my hands not quite steady. It was a vase, tall, maybe 16 inches, with a narrow neck that flared out into a wider, asymmetrical body. The color was the same deep cobalt blue I'd seen in the photograph, but seeing it in person, in actual light instead of a faded old print, was something else entirely. The blue wasn't flat. It shifted as I turned it, deepening into near black in some places, opening up into something almost luminous where the light caught it directly. And running through the blue, in a slow spiral from the base to the neck, was a thread of gold, not painted on, but somehow worked directly into the glass itself, like it had been caught and pulled through the molten material while it was still moving. On the underside of the base, scratched into the glass, in small, careful script, were 2 initials and a date. SV 97. I didn't know what SV stood for yet. I didn't know what any of this meant, in any practical sense. But I knew, holding that vase up to the thin light coming through the workshop's grimy front window, that I was looking at something that had taken real skill, real years of practice to make, and that whoever made it had been good. Genuinely, seriously good. In a way that even someone with zero glass-blowing knowledge could recognize on instinct. I opened the second crate. Another piece, similar style, slightly smaller, a bowl instead of a vase, the same cobalt and gold spiral worked into the rim, the same initials scratched into the base, SV 97. The third crate held 2 pieces wrapped together, padded apart by more of the same cut-up bedsheet fabric, a pair of matching vases, slightly different heights, clearly meant to sit side by side. The 4th and 5th crates each held a single larger sculptural piece, more abstract than the vases and bowls, twisting forms that didn't seem to represent anything in particular, but still managed to catch the light in a way that made me stop and just look for a long moment before setting them down. By the time I got to the 6th crate, my hands had stopped shaking and settled into something closer to reverence, careful, slow, deliberate, the way you'd handle something you already suspected mattered before you had any proof. By the time I'd opened all 6 crates, laid out across the workshop floor on a blanket I'd put down to protect them, I was looking at 31 separate pieces, vases, bowls, a few abstract sculptural forms I didn't even have a name for, every single one in that same unmistakable cobalt and gold style, every single one marked with the same initials and the same year. 31 pieces. Never sold, never displayed, sealed in a locked room for what had to be close to 30 years. I sat there on the dusty floor for a long time, surrounded by glass that caught and scattered the thin morning light in dozens of directions at once, and I genuinely had no idea what any of it was worth, or whether worth even applied to something like this at all. But I had a guess about where to start looking. I had 2 initials, and I had a photograph, still pinned to a corkboard in the front room, of a young man holding the very first piece of this exact run, standing next to an old craftsman named Walter Doyle, who'd cared enough about whatever this was to lock it away from the rest of the world. It took me 2 days of searching to put a full name to the initials, and when I finally did, I had to read the search results 3 times before I let myself believe it. SV stood for Soren Vale. I typed the name into my phone, sitting in the workshop with the 31 pieces still arranged around me on the blanket, and watched page after page of results load, gallery listings, museum acquisition pages, a profile from an arts magazine with a headline calling him one of the most distinctive voices working in studio glass today. Soren Vale, it turned out, had spent the better part of 3 decades building a reputation as one of the most sought-after glass artists in the country. His pieces hung in private collections and regional museums. A retrospective of his work had toured for nearly 2 years. Collectors specifically tracked his auction appearances because his pieces almost never came up for sale. He produced slowly, deliberately, and most of what he made was acquired directly by collectors and institutions before it ever reached an open market. But it was one detail, buried in an old magazine profile, that made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the photograph still pinned to the corkboard 20 feet away. The article mentioned almost in passing that Vale had gotten his start as a teenage apprentice in a small town glass shop under a craftsman the article only identified as a mentor named Walter before striking out on his own in his early 20s. It said Vale rarely discussed those early years publicly, and that almost none of his earliest independent work, a brief, intensely personal series he'd reportedly called the Ember Pieces, made right after leaving his mentor's shop, had ever surfaced publicly. Most collectors and curators who studied his career assumed the early work simply didn't survive, lost or destroyed the way a lot of an artist's earliest, rawest material tends to be. I read that paragraph 4 times. Almost none of his earliest independent work had ever surfaced publicly. I looked up from my phone across the workshop floor at 31 pieces of cobalt and gold glass, every one of them marked with the date 1997. I'm not an art expert, I'm not an appraiser, but I understood, in that moment, that I might be looking at the missing chapter of a major artist's career. The work everyone assumed had been lost, sitting in a room nobody had opened in close to 30 years, because a man named Walter Doyle had decided, for reasons I'd probably never fully know, to seal it away and keep it instead of selling it off when his young apprentice walked out the door to build a career of his own. I didn't sleep much that night. I locked the back room properly this time, with a new deadbolt I bought the next morning with money I genuinely didn't have to spare, and I started looking for someone who could tell me, for certain, exactly what I was sitting on. Finding someone qualified to evaluate the pieces wasn't simple. I called 3 different appraisal services before I found one. A regional fine arts and antiques appraiser named Diane Castellano, who specialized in studio glass and decorative arts, willing to take me seriously over the phone instead of assuming I was wasting her time. "You said 31 pieces, all marked the same way?" Diane asked when I described what I'd found. "Cobalt blue, gold threading, initials SV, dated 97, I said. I looked him up. Soren Vale. There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. If what you're describing is real, Diane said finally, and I mean genuinely real, not a guess based on photos, I need to see this in person as soon as I possibly can. Diane drove out the following week, 2.5 hours from the city, and spent the better part of a full day in that small back room and workshop, examining each piece individually under a portable lamp, photographing the maker's marks, cross-referencing the dates against everything publicly known about Vale's early career, and making phone calls to colleagues, to a gallery that had represented Vale for over a decade even at one point. Leaving the workshop entirely for nearly an hour to take a call in her car that I was fairly sure was with someone close to Vale himself. When she came back inside, her expression had shifted from professional caution into something I hadn't seen on her face all day. I can't give you a final number today, Diane said. This needs to go through formal authentication, provenance research, condition reports, the works. But I can tell you what I'm confident about right now, standing in this room. I waited. These are real, she said. The maker's marks are consistent. The glass technique matches everything documented about his early work, before his style shifted in the early 2000s. And, based on what I was just told on the phone, Vale himself has spoken about this exact period of his career, work he made right after leaving his first mentor's shop, work he's always said he assumed was gone. He's apparently never stopped wondering what happened to it. She looked around the small room, at the empty crates, at the corkboard photograph I'd shown her earlier. Your Walter Doyle didn't lose this work, she said quietly. He kept it. On purpose. For 30 years. The formal authentication process took nearly 6 weeks. Diane coordinated with the gallery that represented Vale, with 2 independent appraisers who specialized in American studio glass, and, eventually, once word had quietly made its way to him, with Soren Vale himself, who flew out personally to see the pieces in the workshop where they'd been made, in the same room he'd apprenticed in nearly 30 years earlier. I'd later describe that meeting as one of the strangest afternoons of my entire life, standing in a workshop I now owned, watching a man I'd read about in arts magazines walk slowly around a room he clearly remembered down to the smallest detail, running his hand along the same workbench, the same furnace, picking up pieces of his own earliest work with an expression somewhere between disbelief and something that looked almost like grief. He told me, eventually sitting on an overturned crate because there wasn't anywhere else to sit, that he and Walter had parted on complicated terms, not a falling out exactly, but the kind of difficult, emotionally loaded split that happens when a young artist outgrows a mentor faster than either of them is ready for. He'd left to build his own studio, his own career, certain at the time that he'd taken every piece of his early work with him. He hadn't known Walter quietly kept this particular series back, the work Vale considered the true beginning of his own voice as an artist, separate from everything he'd been taught. I always thought I lost the most important work I ever made, he told me. Turns out he just didn't want to let it go. He picked up the cobalt vase from the very first photograph, the one with the gold spiral, the one Walter had written, kept this one on the back of a photo about decades earlier, and turned it slowly in his hands, the same way I had the first time I unwrapped it. I made this the week I left, he said quietly. I was so sure I was ready. So sure I didn't need him anymore. He set it back down with more care than seemed strictly necessary. I never got the chance to tell him I was wrong about that. When the formal valuation finally came back, it confirmed what Diane had suspected from that very first day in the workshop, because the pieces represented a documented, previously unknown body of early work from a major living artist, work the artist himself had publicly discussed and long assumed was gone. The collector interest was immediate and significant. Several institutions and private collectors who'd been trying for years to acquire any example of Vale's earliest period expressed interest before the pieces were even formally listed. The combined appraised value of all 31 pieces came back at just over $340,000. I was sitting on the same overturned crate Soren had sat on weeks earlier when Diane read me the final number over the phone. I didn't say anything for almost a full minute. She asked twice if I was still there. "I'm here," I finally said. I bought this building for $500 because it was the only number I had. The first thing I did, once the sale process was finalized and the money actually landed, wasn't anything dramatic. I didn't buy a car, even though mine was still sitting on 211,000 miles. I didn't move into a luxury apartment, even though I could have, technically. For the first time in my adult life afforded one, I sat with the number for almost a full week before I let myself spend a single dollar of it, because some part of me, the part that had spent 3 months guarding a Ziploc bag of cash like it was the only solid ground left under my feet, still couldn't quite trust that it was real. I kept checking the account balance on my cracked phone screen, half expecting it to have reverted to the same handful of dollars I'd lived on for months. I paid off every single piece of debt I'd racked up during the worst of it, the medical bills from the accident that started the whole slide, the collections calls I'd stopped answering months earlier, because there was nothing I could do about them anyway. I got myself an actual apartment, small and unremarkable, but with a working lock on the door and a bed that wasn't the back seat of a car. And I quit both of my jobs, not out of spite, but because I finally had room in my life to figure out what I actually wanted to do, instead of just what I had to do to survive the week. What I decided, after a few months of sitting with all of it, was that I didn't want to sell the building. I kept Doyle Glassworks. I had the roof properly repaired, the electricity restored, the front window finally uncovered after 3 years behind plywood, letting actual daylight back into a room that hadn't seen it in nearly as long as I'd been alive. I didn't know the first thing about glassblowing, not really, but Soren, who'd stayed in touch in the months since that first strange afternoon in the workshop, offered, almost as a kind of thank you for what I'd given back to him, to teach me the basics himself, on the same equipment Walter Doyle had once taught him on. I kept 3 of the 31 pieces. Diane told me I was within my rights to sell every single one, but something about giving away the entire run, the whole rediscovered chapter of Walter's quiet decision to hold on to his apprentice's earliest work, felt wrong to me, like erasing the one part of this story that had nothing to do with money at all. I kept the very first piece from the photograph, the tall cobalt vase with the gold spiral, the one Walter wrote kept this one about. It sits on a shelf in the front room of the shop now, in the exact spot where the old cracked display case used to be. If you drove down that same street today, you wouldn't recognize the building from the listing photo that started all of this. The plywood's gone. The sign's been repainted, the gold letters restored as close as I could get them to the original, reading clearly now for the first time in years, Doyle Glassworks. The furnace is running again, not constantly, not yet, since I'm still learning, slowly, carefully, with Soren stopping by every few weeks to check on my progress and correct my form. The workbench that used to be buried under dust now has my own early pieces scattered across it, lopsided, bubbled, the kind of rough, honest first attempts Walter Doyle once kept around his own workshop for the exact same reason I understand now, not because they're worth anything, but because you remember exactly what went wrong with each one. And that's how you get better. I still have the photograph. It's not pinned to a corkboard anymore, it's framed now, hanging in the front room, right next to the cobalt vase it shows being held for the very first time. Underneath it, I added a small printed card with the same handwritten note Walter left on the back all those years ago. S. First solo piece, The Ember Run. Kept this one. 3 months ago, I was sleeping in the back seat of a car with no plan beyond getting through the next shift. Today, I own a building locals are starting to call one of the most interesting small businesses in town. I'm running the early days of what's becoming my own modest glass-blowing practice, and I keep on a shelf where anyone walking through the door can see it. A single piece of cobalt and gold glass that nearly got auctioned off into a stranger's living room before anyone realized what it actually was. I still don't fully understand why Walter Doyle locked that room and kept the truth sealed inside it for 30 years, instead of selling it the moment Soren's career took off. I have theories that he wasn't ready to admit his apprentice had surpassed him, that he simply couldn't bring himself to profit off the last thing his student made under his roof, or maybe something simpler than either of those, that he just liked knowing it was there. Some nights, closing up the shop alone, I find myself talking to him a little, out loud, to an empty workshop and a cold furnace, thanking a man I never met for a decision I'll probably never fully understand. But I'm grateful every single day that he made it, because if he hadn't, there would have been nothing behind that door for a 21-year-old with nowhere left to sleep to find, on the one night I finally let myself stop and look. If my story moved you even half as much as it meant to me telling it, do me a favor and hit that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who might need to hear something like this right now. Drop a comment and let me know what part hit you the hardest, because I read every single one. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications, because I've got more stories like this one coming, about ordinary people who took one last chance on something nobody else believed in, and it changed absolutely everything. I'll see you in the next one.